A single porcelain plate shatters on marble, and her laughter cuts through the silence like a knife. Mara Winters, with her designer clothes and perfect smile, has no idea that the clumsy waiter she just humiliated is Evan Crowley, the rightful heir to the very restaurant she treats as her personal playground. What began as a simple plan to reclaim his father's stolen legacy becomes a dangerous game of secrets and lies when Evan discovers the truth. His father's death was no accident. Now, with only 48 hours before the restaurant is sold forever, Evan must choose between revenge and redemption. But in Manhattan's cutthroat world of fine dining, second chances come at a devastating price, one that could cost him everything his father died protecting. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or pushed aside, this story will captivate your heart from the first moment to the last shocking revelation. Follow our channel for more unforgettable stories of justice and redemption, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through Moretti's, the kind of upscale Manhattan restaurant where even the bread baskets cost more than Evan Crowley's entire outfit. The ceramic plate exploded into jagged white fragments across the polished marble floor, sending bolognese sauce splattering like a crime scene onto the shoes of 3 different patrons. Time slowed painfully as every head turned toward the commotion. 63 pairs of eyes. Evan had counted them when he started his shift, now all fixated on his trembling hands, on his crimson face, on the disaster that was about to cost him a job he desperately needed. First day? The voice cut through the awkward silence like a diamond on glass. Sharp, deliberate, dripping with amusement. Evan looked up to meet Mara Winters' perfectly mascaraed eyes. She sat at table 12, her blonde hair swept into the kind of casual updo that probably took 2 hours to perfect. A Rolex gleamed on her slender wrist as she raised a martini glass, her red lips curving into what could only be described as a smirk. "Looks like it might be your last too," she added loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Several diners chuckled, grateful for the tension-breaking joke at someone else's expense. Mara's companions, 3 other women dressed in similarly expensive attire, giggled in unison. The sound felt like tiny needles pricking Evan's skin. "I'm sorry," Evan mumbled, dropping to his knees to collect the larger shards. "I'll bring another order right away, ma'am." "Don't bother," Mara said with a dismissive wave. "We're moving to La Pergola next door anyway. This place clearly isn't what it used to be." The restaurant manager, Vincent, materialized beside Evan, his thin mouth pressed into a bloodless line. "Kitchen now," he hissed, already apologizing profusely to the table as Evan retreated, the back of his neck burning with humiliation. In the chaos of the bustling kitchen, Vincent cornered Evan by the prep stations. "What the hell was that? $300 of Wagyu beef on the floor. If you can't handle a simple 3-top, why did you lie on your application?" Evan stared at a point on the wall just behind Vincent's head, at the exact spot where, 17 years earlier, a black-framed photograph had hung. A photograph of Robert Crowley, his father, standing proudly on opening day of what was then called Crowley's Fine Dining. "I didn't lie," Evan said quietly. "I can do better. Please, I need this job." Vincent scrutinized him, running a hand through his thinning hair. "One more chance, but you're on dish duty the rest of tonight. And tomorrow." Evan nodded, relieved but hollow. As Vincent walked away, Evan's eyes drifted to the old brick wall beside the main ovens. That wall had witnessed everything: the rise of his father's restaurant, the rave reviews, the celebrity clientele, and then, that terrible night when Robert Crowley had clutched his chest and crumpled to the floor, right there by the Salamander Grill, dead before the ambulance could even navigate through Manhattan traffic. Evan had been just 10 years old when it happened, too young to understand how quickly an empire could crumble, how medical bills, predatory lenders, and his mother's grief-stricken inability to manage the business would strip everything away within months. Now at 27, with an economics degree and 7 years of restaurant experience carefully concealed from his resume, Evan was back where it all began, back where it all ended. 4 hours later, as the last customers filtered out and the kitchen staff headed to a nearby bar for post-shift drinks, Evan sat alone on the back steps of the service entrance. His fingers traced the embroidered M on the napkin, the only thing he had taken from the dining room. The restaurant's new monogram had replaced his family's crest, but the linen supplier was the same. His father had always insisted on quality. "Dad," he whispered, looking up at the neon sign that now read Moretti's, where Crowley's had once proudly glowed. Today was just the first step. I'm going to fix everything. The cool autumn breeze carried his promise into the New York night. Evan folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into his wallet next to a worn business card with the name E. Crowley Investments, LLC, printed in simple, understated font. What Vincent didn't know, what no one at Moretti's knew, was that the clumsy new waiter had been slowly buying back shares of the restaurant's ownership through a series of shell companies for the past 3 years. One more month, and he would have controlling interest. One more month until he could reclaim his father's legacy. What Evan didn't know was that Mara Winters was watching him through the tinted glass of the restaurant's rear window, her curiosity piqued by the strange new waiter who couldn't carry a tray, yet somehow seemed completely at home in a restaurant he'd supposedly never worked in before. She took a sip of her after-hour champagne, a habit she'd maintained as the restaurant's unofficial VIP ever since she'd begun dating Vincent 6 months ago. Her eyes narrowed as she observed Evan carefully folding that napkin. "What's your story, busboy?" she murmured to herself, completely unaware that her casual cruelty earlier had been directed at the man who, in less than 30 days, would technically be her boyfriend's boss, and the true owner of the establishment where she'd just demanded preferential treatment. Mara Winters had no idea who Evan Crowley really was, or what he had come back to do. Mara Winters woke with a start, her silk sheets damp with sweat. The nightmare had felt so real. She'd been serving tables in an empty restaurant, but each time she turned around, all the customers had her face, all different ages, all laughing at her. Their mocking voices still echoed in her mind as she reached for her phone. 7:43 a.m. Shit. She was late. 15 minutes later, she rushed through her morning routine, applying just enough makeup to look presentable, her blonde hair hastily pulled into a messy bun that somehow still looked deliberate. Mara's Chelsea apartment, small by most standards but exorbitantly priced even by New York metrics, was her pride and joy, paid for by the trust fund her father had established before his investment firm collapsed, and he'd retreated to a modest condo in Florida. The irony wasn't lost on her. She lived beyond her means to maintain the illusion that those means still existed. By 8:30, she was power walking toward the law firm where she worked as a paralegal. Not the career she'd envisioned with her Brown University degree, but it kept the lights on while she networked her way toward something better, something worthy of a Winters. "Late again, Ms. Winters?" her supervisor, Gloria, remarked without looking up from her computer. "Doctor's appointment," Mara lied smoothly. "I emailed you yesterday." Gloria's raised eyebrow suggested she didn't believe it, but she said nothing. Mara had perfected the art of being just valuable enough to keep around despite her frequent appointments and extended lunch breaks, many of which were spent at Moretti's, where her boyfriend Vincent comped her meals and made her feel like the restaurant royalty she believed she deserved to be. Later that afternoon, Mara pushed through the heavy oak doors of Moretti's for what she called her business lunch, though no actual business was ever conducted. The maitre d' greeted her with the practiced smile reserved for regular customers who were more trouble than their bills were worth. "Ms. Winters, your usual table?" "Please," she said, not bothering to remove her sunglasses as she followed him to her preferred corner spot with a view of both the entrance and the entirety of the main dining room. As she settled in, she spotted him, the waiter from yesterday, the one who'd made a fool of himself. He was carefully arranging place settings at a table across the room, his movements precise and methodical now, nothing like the bumbling server who'd dropped an entire entree. Curious, she watched as he disappeared into the employees' area, presumably to store his belongings before starting his shift. Something about him nagged at her, a familiarity she couldn't place. When Paolo returned to take her drink order, she nodded toward the back. "That new waiter, is he actually staying after yesterday's disaster?" Paolo's professional demeanor cracked slightly with a small smile. Vincent decided to give him another chance. On dish duty, though. Mara mused, tapping her manicured nails against the linen tablecloth. Interesting. When Paolo left, Mara found herself inexplicably drawn to the staff area. She waited until the hallway was clear before slipping past the employees-only sign, justifying her trespass with the mental note that dating the manager gave her certain privileges. The staff room was modest. Metal lockers lined one wall, a small table with mismatched chairs occupied the center, and a bulletin board covered in schedules and notices hung opposite. No one was around, likely all busy with the lunch rush that had just begun. Mara's eyes scanned the lockers, landing on one with a small piece of masking tape labeled E. Crowley in neat block letters. The name meant nothing to her, but it had to be him, the clumsy waiter. The locker wasn't fully closed, a corner of something poking out from the gap. Before she could reconsider, Mara glanced over her shoulder and gently pulled the locker door open wider. Inside was sparse: a worn backpack, a water bottle, and a framed photograph partially wrapped in a soft cloth. Curiosity overwhelming her better judgment, Mara carefully slid the photo out. The image showed a restaurant that looked eerily similar to Moretti's, but the sign in the picture clearly read, Crowley's Fine Dining. A tall man with sandy hair stood proudly in front, his arm around a small boy who couldn't be more than 7 or 8. The resemblance between the boy and the waiter she'd mocked was unmistakable. "What are you doing?" Mara nearly dropped the photo as she whirled around. Evan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I got lost looking for the restroom," she lied, quickly sliding the photo back into his locker. "The restrooms are in the opposite direction," he said quietly. "You should leave before someone sees you." Before she could respond, the sounds of commotion from the dining room drew their attention. An elderly man was arguing with Vincent near the host stand. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 30 years, the man was saying, his voice carrying even to the back hallway. "I always sit at table 9. It was Robert's favorite too." "I'm sorry, sir, but that table isn't available," Vincent replied firmly, though the table, positioned near the large bay window, was clearly empty and set for service. Mara watched as Evan stiffened at the mention of the name Robert, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He brushed past her without another word, but as he reached the dining room, he fumbled a water pitcher he was carrying, spilling its contents across the floor. "Not again, Crowley," Vincent hissed. "Get the mop." The elderly man's head snapped toward Evan at the mention of his last name, his eyes widening in recognition. Evan quickly turned away, disappearing into the kitchen before the man could approach him. Mara returned to her table, more intrigued than ever. The name Crowley, the old restaurant in the photo, the elderly man's insistence on table 9, Evan's reaction. There was a story here, one that made her forget all about her embarrassing nightmare and late start to the day. As she sipped her martini, she found herself watching Evan whenever he emerged from the kitchen. He moved through the restaurant with a strange mix of deference and ownership, like someone who knew every inch of the place but was pretending not to. And whenever his gaze drifted to the empty table 9, something like grief flickered across his features. Who exactly was Evan Crowley? And what did he have to do with Moretti's? The questions swirled in Mara's mind like the olive in her drink, untethered yet connected to something deeper beneath the surface. The morning delivery arrived at Moretti's precisely at 5:45 a.m., just as it had for the past 20 years. Marco, the same courier who had delivered to Crowley's Fine Dining in the old days, wheeled in boxes of produce, fresh fish packed in ice, and a stack of mail addressed to management. His weathered hands sorted through the items with practiced efficiency, barely noticing Evan polishing glasses behind the bar. "Morning, kid," Marco nodded. "Early bird today, huh?" Evan smiled politely. "Just trying to impress the boss." Marco squinted at him curiously. "You know, you look familiar. You from around here?" Before Evan could respond, Vincent burst through the kitchen door, his perpetual scowl already firmly in place despite the early hour. He snatched the mail from Marco's hands and flipped through the envelopes with impatient fingers. Bill, advertisement," he muttered. Then his fingers froze on a plain brown envelope with no return address. Just Moretti's written in blue ink. Vincent's face drained of color. He ripped open the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a single sheet of paper. From his position, Evan could just make out a single line of text. "The debt vences in 7 days. Everything okay, Vince?" Marco asked. "Fine," Vincent snapped, crumpling the paper and shoving it into his pocket. "Just another solicitor. Nothing important." But Evan had seen the way Vincent's forehead beaded with sweat, how his left eye twitched, the universal tells of a man who had just received very bad news indeed. As Vincent retreated to his office, slamming the door behind him, Evan's mind raced. 7 days. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. 2 hours later, the restaurant staff trickled in for the morning shift. Evan had been relegated to prep work, chopping vegetables, filling salt and pepper shakers, and polishing silverware. Menial tasks designed to keep him away from customers after his disastrous performance. He worked diligently, keeping his head down while his ears remained attuned to the conversation swirling around him. "Vincent's been locked in his office all morning," whispered Sophia, the hostess, to Paolo as they arranged menus at the front station. "I heard him yelling on the phone about payment extensions." "Again?" Paolo replied, lowering his voice. "That's the third time this month. I'm starting to wonder if we'll get our paychecks on Friday." Evan carefully folded napkins into perfect triangles, absorbing every word while appearing thoroughly engrossed in his task. The financial situation was worse than he'd initially calculated. According to his research, Moretti's was turning a modest profit. Not spectacular, but sustainable. This suggested someone was siphoning funds, or there was another debt he hadn't uncovered in his investigation. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mara Winters, who strode in with the confidence of someone who owned the place rather than someone who merely dated the manager. Her tailored navy pantsuit suggested she'd come directly from her law firm, though it was only 11:30 a.m. "Vincent in his office?" she asked Sophia, who nodded. As Mara headed toward the back, her phone rang. Evan watched her expression transform from annoyed to alarmed in the span of seconds. "What do you mean, emergency admission?" She hissed into the phone, turning away from the staff. "I just paid for the last—" "No, I understand. Yes, I'll figure something out." She ended the call, her perfectly manicured hand trembling slightly as she pressed it against her forehead. For a brief moment, her carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath the polished exterior. Then, noticing Evan watching her, she straightened her shoulders and fixed him with an icy glare. "Enjoying the show, busboy?" she snapped. Evan shook his head. "Not at all. Is everything okay?" "Like you care," she scoffed, but her voice lacked its usual edge. "Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who doesn't know you," Evan offered quietly. No judgment, no history, just an ear. For a moment, Mara seemed to consider his words. Something in her expression softened fractionally, as if she might actually open up. Then Vincent emerged from his office, his face tight with stress. "Mara, what are you doing here so early?" The moment between Evan and Mara evaporated instantly. She turned to Vincent, plastering on a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thought I'd surprise you for lunch," she said, linking her arm through his. "Everything okay? You look stressed." Vincent glanced around, noting the staff's poorly disguised interest in their conversation. "In my office," he muttered, leading her away. As they disappeared, Evan resumed his work, mentally adjusting his plans. Whatever financial crisis was unfolding, it clearly involved more than just the restaurant. The pieces were starting to connect. Vincent's desperation, the mysterious debt notice, Mara's phone call about an emergency admission. Something, or someone, was forcing Vincent's hand. The lunch service passed in a blur of activity. Evan, still banished from waiting tables, helped the kitchen staff plate dishes and run food to the service counter. His competence in the kitchen raised a few eyebrows among the cooks who had expected the clumsy waiter to be equally inept behind the scenes. "Where'd you learn knife skills like that?" asked Gabriella, the sous chef, watching him dice onions with expert precision. "Here and there," Evan replied vaguely. "My father taught me the basics." As the evening shift approached, the restaurant emptied briefly during the transition between lunch and dinner service. Evan seized the opportunity, slipping into the dining room while the staff took their break. He moved to table 9, his father's favorite table, positioned perfectly to see both the entrance and the open kitchen. The table where Robert Crowley had entertained food critics, celebrated the restaurant's first Michelin star, and taught his young son about the business. Evan ran his fingers along the edge of the table, memories washing over him like waves. This table had witnessed his family's greatest triumphs and later their greatest loss. Vincent had kept it off limits for some reason, a reason Evan intended to discover. He carefully adjusted the place setting, then reached into his pocket and removed a small triangular folded napkin. With practiced fingers, he tucked it partially under the bread plate, the same way his father had done it, a signature touch that regulars had once recognized as a mark of special attention from the owner. "What are you doing?" Evan turned to find Mara watching him. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Just setting the tables," he replied, stepping away from table 9. "That's not how we fold napkins here," she said, approaching to inspect his work. "And why this table?" Vincent specifically said it wasn't to be used today. Force of habit, Evan said, maintaining his composure. Where I worked before, we folded them this way. Mara picked up the triangular napkin, studying it with curious fingers. There's something embroidered here, not the Moretti's logo. She squinted at the faint, faded crest. What is this? CFD? No idea, Evan lied, gently taking the napkin from her. Must be an old one from the linen service. As he pocketed the napkin, Mara's penetrating gaze made it clear she didn't believe him. Whatever game she thought he was playing, she was determined to figure it out. You know, she said quietly, I've been coming to this restaurant for years, long before it was Moretti's. I was just a kid, but I remember it used to have another name. Evan's heart skipped. Is that so? Crowley's, she said, watching his face carefully. Any relation? Common enough name, Evan replied with a shrug, turning away to hide the emotion threatening to break through his carefully maintained facade. If you'll excuse me, I need to help prep for dinner service. As he walked away, he could feel Mara's eyes boring into his back, peeling away layers of his deception one by one. She was getting too close to the truth, a truth he wasn't ready to reveal. Not until he had secured what rightfully belonged to his family. The morning rain battered against the windows of Moretti's like impatient fingers, creating a melancholic soundtrack for the empty restaurant. Evan arrived early again, shaking water from his jacket as he slipped through the employee entrance. 4 days had passed since he'd overheard Vincent discussing the mysterious debt, and tension hung in the air like the heavy scent of garlic that perpetually clung to the kitchen walls. In the dim light of early dawn, Gabriella, the sous chef, was already prepping for breakfast service. Her strong hands moved with practiced efficiency as she sorted through a drawer of utensils. Buenos dias, she greeted Evan without looking up. Vincent wants everyone here for a staff meeting at 2. Sounds serious. Evan nodded, hanging his wet jacket on the employee rack. As he turned, he noticed Gabriella holding something that made his heart skip. A tarnished brass keyring with a collection of mismatched keys, some modern, some antique. One in particular caught his eye. Small, ornate, with a distinctive crown design on its head. Where did you find those? He asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the sudden dryness in his throat. Gabriella shrugged. Behind the drawer when I was cleaning. Been there forever by the looks of it. Probably from the old management. She jingled the keys. I'll give them to Vincent when he gets in. I can take them, Evan offered, extending his hand a bit too eagerly. I'm doing inventory in the cellar anyway. Gabriella gave him a curious look but handed over the keys. Whatever. Just don't forget, Vincent's been in a mood lately. Evan clutched the keyring, feeling the weight of his family's legacy literally in his palm. The crowned key had been his father's personal key to the wine cellar, a space that had once housed a collection valued at over $500,000. After his father's death, the entire collection had mysteriously depreciated on the books, then disappeared entirely during the ownership transition. When the breakfast rush began, Evan was assigned to assist the hostess, a promotion from dish duty, but still far from the dining room floor. The respite gave him an opportunity to examine the keys more closely. 7 in total, most unidentifiable without testing, but the crowned key, that one he knew intimately. During the mid-morning lull, Evan seized his opportunity. He descended the narrow staircase to the cellar, the musty smell of earth and aging wood enveloping him as he entered the space that had once been his childhood playground. The cellar had been renovated since the Crowley days, the elegant wooden wine racks replaced with utilitarian metal shelving, the tasting table removed to make room for bulk storage. But the bones remained the same, and if his memory served him correctly. Evan moved to the far corner of the cellar, where a stack of flour sacks sat piled against the stone wall. He carefully shifted them aside, revealing a small metal grate in the floor, an old drainage system from the days when the building had been a brewery in the 1920s. Kneeling, he pried the grate up with his fingers and reached into the darkness beneath. His heart raced as his fingers brushed against cold metal. He withdrew a small rusted lockbox, its surface coated with the dust of 17 years of neglect. With trembling hands, Evan tried the crowned key in the lock. It turned with a reluctant groan, the mechanism stiff but functional. Inside lay a yellowed envelope addressed to Evan Crowley in his father's distinctive handwriting. The paper was fragile, the edges softened by time and dampness. Evan stared at it, suddenly terrified of what it might contain. After all these years of planning his return, of plotting to reclaim his family's legacy, he found himself hesitating at this tangible connection to his father. A sound from the stairway startled him. Footsteps descending. Quickly, Evan pocketed the envelope and replaced the lockbox and grate, pushing the flour sacks back into position just as Vincent appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "What are you doing down here?" Vincent demanded, his suspicious gaze sweeping the cellar. "Inventory," Evan replied, holding up the clipboard he'd brought as cover. "Gabriella said you needed it for the staff meeting." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "I assigned that to Paolo. He asked me to cover for him." Evan lied smoothly. His daughter's school called. Vincent seemed unconvinced but was distracted by the sudden blast of cold air that swept through the cellar. "Damn it, the heating system's out again. Did you check the thermostat?" "It's dead," Evan confirmed. "Probably the circuit breaker." Vincent ran a hand through his thinning hair. "The maintenance guy can't come until tomorrow. The dining room's already freezing." He cursed under his breath. "The boiler controls are in the utility room behind the pantry. See if you can figure it out. Weren't you saying you worked maintenance at your last job?" Another fabrication in Evan's carefully constructed resume. "I'll take a look," he agreed. As Vincent trudged back upstairs, Evan breathed a sigh of relief. The encounter had been too close, but it had also provided him with an excuse to explore more of the restaurant's back areas, places that might hold additional clues to whatever financial crisis was threatening his family's former establishment. The utility room was exactly as Evan remembered, a cramped space housing the building's ancient boiler system, electrical panels, and assorted maintenance supplies. He located the tripped breaker easily enough and reset it, hearing the distant hum as the heating system groaned back to life. But his attention was drawn to the back wall, where a stack of dusty cardboard boxes sat partially obscured by a broken shelf. One box in particular stood out, labeled RC 1996 in faded marker, his father's initials and the year Crowley's fine dining had opened. Evan glanced over his shoulder to ensure he was alone, then pulled the box free. Inside were old ledgers, menus, and financial documents, the mundane paperwork of restaurant operation that had somehow escaped the purge when ownership changed hands. But beneath these items lay a leather-bound journal he instantly recognized as his father's business diary. His fingers trembling slightly, Evan opened the journal to the last entry, dated just 3 days before his father's fatal heart attack. The handwriting was hurried, less precise than his father's usual meticulous script. Met with M today. Offered 2.5 MET for controlling interest. Declined. Something off about the whole arrangement. Running background check. If findings confirm suspicions, must warn E about the implications for future. Trust fund should be untouchable regardless. Evan's breath caught. The trust fund, the money his father had supposedly set aside for his education and future, had vanished along with everything else after his death. His mother had been told it was part of the restaurant's assets, liquidated to pay debts. But if his father's notes were accurate, that money should have been protected. The sound of the cellar door opening above startled Evan from his thoughts. He quickly replaced the journal, shoved the box back into position, and busied himself with the breaker panel as footsteps approached. Mara appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "Vincent's looking for you. The heat's back on, but table 7 is complaining about their appetizers." "I'll be right up," Evan replied, avoiding her scrutinizing gaze. "What did you find down here?" she asked, making no move to leave. "Besides the breaker switch? Just dust and spiders," he said with a shrug. Mara stepped further into the small room, her expensive perfume incongruous with the musty surroundings. "You know, it's interesting. I've been asking around about you, Evan Crowley." The way she emphasized his last name sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature. "Should I be flattered or concerned?" he asked, forcing a light tone. "That depends," she countered, moving closer. "On whether you're really who you say you are." Her eyes flicked to the box he'd hastily replaced, its label still visible. RC 1996. Robert Crowley, I presume. Before Evan could respond, a commotion erupted from above. Raised voices, the clatter of dishes. Mara's head turned toward the sound, momentarily distracted, and Evan seized the opportunity. "We should get back," he said, moving past her toward the stairs. "Sounds like they need help up there." As they ascended to the main floor, they found the source of the disruption. Amanda, a newer server, stood trembling beside table 12, a shattered glass of red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like a Rorschach test. Across from her sat a tight-lipped woman in her 50s, her designer blouse spattered with Cabernet. "I'm so sorry," Amanda was saying, her voice quavering. "It was an accident. A costly one," the woman snapped. "This is a Burberry," Vincent materialized, profuse apologies flowing as he escorted the woman to the restroom. As he passed, he hissed at Amanda, "You're done. Get your things." The young server's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "But it was my first mistake, and it wasn't even my fault." The gentleman at the next table bumped my arm when he stood up. Vincent was unmoved. "I don't care if the Pope himself caused it. This is the third complaint about your section today. Out." As Amanda fled to the back, Mara watched the scene with an unreadable expression. For a moment it seemed she might speak up, perhaps defend the young server or at least corroborate her story about the neighboring diner. Instead, she simply turned away, her eyes meeting Evan's briefly with something like shame flickering across her features. In that moment, Evan saw beyond Mara's carefully constructed facade to the vulnerability beneath, a glimpse of someone caught in circumstances not entirely of her making. It was the same expression he'd noticed when she received that troubling phone call days earlier. "I could clean that up," he offered to Vincent, who was still fuming. "Fine," Vincent snapped, "and you'll take over her section. Try not to drop anything." As Vincent stormed off, Evan gathered cleaning supplies and approached the table. Mara lingered nearby, watching him with renewed interest. "That was decent of you," she said quietly, taking her section. "Most people wouldn't stick their neck out after being on dish duty." Evan shrugged. "Everyone deserves a second chance." "Do they?" Mara asked, something wistful in her voice. Then more quietly, as if speaking to herself, "I wonder if that applies to everyone, or just to those who haven't fallen too far." Before Evan could respond, she walked away, leaving him to wonder about the secrets she might be harboring and how they might intersect with his own. The Friday dinner rush at Moretti's was in full swing, the dining room humming with the melodic chaos of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Evan moved between tables with newfound confidence, his previous clumsiness seemingly forgotten as he navigated the floor with the precision of someone who knew every creaking floorboard and tight corner by heart. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered his father's journal, 3 nights spent in his sparse studio apartment poring over the envelope's contents, a letter his father had written just days before his death. The yellowed pages had revealed suspicions about financial irregularities, references to someone identified only as M, and ominous warnings about protecting the family legacy. Most troubling was the line that kept Evan awake at night. "If anything happens to me, trust no one associated with the restaurant except Gregory Winters." Gregory Winters, Mara's father. The connection had struck Evan like a physical blow. According to his research, Gregory had been one of his father's most loyal investors before his own financial collapse 5 years ago. But the letter suggested a deeper relationship, one built on trust rather than mere business interests. "Refill on the Cabernet, sir?" Evan asked, approaching a table where an elderly gentleman sat alone, methodically cutting his steak into perfect squares. "Please," the man nodded, studying Evan's face with narrowed eyes. "Have we met before, young man? You seem familiar." Evan carefully poured the wine. "I have one of those faces, I guess." The man, Mr. Harrington according to the reservation, continued to scrutinize him. "No, it's more than that. You remind me of someone I knew years ago, a restaurateur with vision. Robert something." Evan's hand trembled slightly, a drop of wine escaping onto the white tablecloth. "Crowley?" he supplied, his voice barely audible over the restaurant din. "That's it, mister." Harrington's eyes lit up. "Robert Crowley. This was his place before the tragedy." "You related?" "Distant cousin." Evan lied, dabbing at the wine stain with a napkin. "I heard stories growing up. Thought I'd see the place for myself." "Damn shame what happened." Harrington shook his head. "Robert was a good man. Had this place running like clockwork. Food still decent, but it lost its soul when he passed." Evan swallowed the emotion rising in his throat. "What do you remember about him?" "Integrity," Harrington answered without hesitation. "Man could have cut corners, brought in cheaper ingredients when costs rose, but he never compromised. Said his customers deserved the best, even if it meant thinner margins." He sipped his wine thoughtfully. "And loyal to a fault. kept staff who'd made mistakes because he believed in second chances. Heard he even helped that mater, what was his name? Mitchell? Michael? Marco? Evan supplied automatically, then inwardly cursed his slip. Harrington raised an eyebrow. Good memory for those distant cousin stories. Before Evan could respond, Mr. Harrington's phone rang. He excused himself to take the call, leaving Evan momentarily alone with his thoughts and the weight of his father's legacy. Across the room, Mara sat at her usual corner table, picking at a salad while scrolling through her phone. Her usual companions were absent tonight. Instead, she dined alone, occasionally glancing up to survey the restaurant with restless eyes. When Evan approached to clear an empty cocktail glass, she barely acknowledged him. Her attention was fixed on her phone screen, where Evan glimpsed a hospital billing portal before she quickly locked the display. "Everything all right with your meal?" he asked, maintaining his server persona. "Fine," she replied distractedly. Then, seeming to make a decision, she looked up at him directly. "Actually, no. The dressing is too vinegary, the croutons are stale, and I've been waiting 15 minutes for my entree." None of which was true. Her salad had arrived perfectly dressed just moments ago, and she'd barely touched it. "I'll check on your entree right away," Evan replied professionally. "And I can bring a fresh salad with different dressing if you'd prefer." "Don't bother," she sighed, her combativeness suddenly deflating. The entree is fine." As Evan turned to leave, Mara spoke again, her voice lower. "Your father." Evan froze mid-step, his back to her. "Robert Crowley," she continued. "He knew my father, didn't he?" Slowly, Evan turned back. "What makes you think that?" "I found an old photo at my dad's place in Florida last weekend. They were standing right here in this restaurant, arms around each other's shoulders, looking like they'd just won the lottery." She studied his face carefully. "You have his eyes. Same color, same shape." Evan maintained his composure, though his pulse raced. "Lots of people have blue eyes." "Not like that," Mara persisted. "Not with that little fleck of gold in the left iris. It's distinctive. My father used to say Robert Crowley had a touch of Midas in his eye." She paused. "Why are you here, Evan?" "Really?" Before he could formulate a response, Vincent appeared at the table. All obsequious smiles for Mara. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Ms. Winters?" "Perfect as always, Vincent," she replied smoothly, her demeanor shifting like quicksilver back to the entitled regular. "Though I think my server might be getting a bit too personal with the small talk." Vincent shot Evan a warning glare. "I apologize for that. Crowley, table 9 needs their check." As Evan retreated, he could feel Mara's gaze following him, probing and analytical. She was putting the pieces together faster than he'd anticipated. The question was, what would she do with the information? An hour later, as the dinner service wound down, Mr. Harrington prepared to leave. He handed Evan a black American Express card, then changed his mind. "Actually, I think I'll pay old school tonight," he said, withdrawing a checkbook from his jacket pocket. Robert always appreciated tradition. Evan processed the check payment, noting with professional detachment that Mr. Harrington had left a generous 30% tip. It wasn't until he was filing the check in the register that he noticed what was written on the memo line. "For R.C.'s son. He'd be proud." And beneath that, a phone number. Evan's hands trembled as he tucked the check into his pocket rather than the register. He'd just committed his first actual fireable offense since starting at Moretti's, but instinct told him this connection was too important to lose. As he turned, he found himself face to face with Mara, who had approached the host's stand to say goodnight to Paolo. Her eyes flicked to Evan's pocket, where the edge of the check was just visible. "Stealing now?" she asked quietly, her tone more curious than accusatory. "It's not what it looks like," Evan replied. "It never is with you," she said, then surprising him completely. "Walk me out?" Vincent had to leave early. Some issue with the wine distributor. Confused but intrigued, Evan nodded. He helped her with her coat, a gesture that seemed to surprise her, and followed her outside into the crisp autumn night. On the sidewalk beneath the soft glow of the restaurant's exterior lighting, Mara turned to face him. "I know who you are, Evan Crowley. What I don't know is what you're planning." Evan remained silent, calculating his options. "My father lost everything 5 years ago," she continued. "His investment firm, his reputation, his friends, all gone. The only person who stood by him was my mother, and she's dying." Her voice caught slightly on the last word. "Lupus." Advanced stage. The treatments are experimental, expensive, and not covered by insurance. I'm sorry, Evan said, meaning it. But I don't see. Vincent is helping me pay for her care. Mara cut in. Or rather, the restaurant is. Those comped meals, the special treatment, the cash he slips me each week, it's not because we're dating. It's payment. For what? Evan asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Mara's eyes, illuminated by the streetlight, were hard as gemstones. For keeping quiet about what really happened to Crowley's fine dining. About what happened to your father's legacy. A taxi slowed beside them, its yellow light casting strange shadows across Mara's face. She opened the door but paused before getting in. I'm not the villain you think I am, Evan. But I'm not a hero either. I'm just trying to save the one person I have left. She slipped into the cab, then looked back at him. Whatever you're planning, remember that not everything is as simple as it seems, especially when it comes to family. As the taxi pulled away, Evan stood motionless on the sidewalk, the weight of Mr. Harrington's check in his pocket suddenly heavier than before. The game had changed. Mara knew who he was, and apparently she knew something about his father's death that even he didn't. But she had also inadvertently confirmed his suspicions. Vincent was embezzling from the restaurant, the same restaurant Evan was mere days away from legally controlling through his carefully orchestrated stock acquisition plan. Inside his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line read, "Urgent, meeting requested, Moretti's Holdings, LLC." The final pieces were moving into place. But now, Evan had to decide how much of his father's legacy was worth salvaging, and at what cost to others who might be as much victims as he had been. The sleek glass tower on Madison Avenue housed the offices of Pritchard and Associates, the law firm representing E. Crowley Investments, LLC. Evan sat in the waiting area, his leg bouncing nervously beneath the tailored suit he'd retrieved from his apartment that morning, a stark contrast to the waiter's uniform he'd worn for the past 2 weeks. The receptionist had offered him coffee in a real porcelain cup, a small courtesy that nonetheless reminded him how different his two worlds were. "Mr. Crowley?" A polished woman in her 50s emerged from the conference room. "I'm Diane Pritchard. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Evan rose, extending his hand. The email sounded urgent. "It is." Her expression was grim as she ushered him inside, where 3 men in expensive suits waited around a mahogany table. "This is Harold Wilkes, representing Moretti Holdings, and these gentlemen are from First Manhattan Capital." Evan recognized the name immediately. First Manhattan Capital was the investment firm that had provided the financing when his father's restaurant changed hands after his death. According to his research, they still held a significant stake in the property and business. "Please sit." Diane gestured to an empty chair. "As I mentioned in my email, there's been an unexpected development. Harold Wilkes, a corpulent man with thinning hair and an aggressive cologne, slid a document across the table. "We've received a competitive offer for Moretti's." Evan's stomach tightened as he scanned the paperwork. "Lux Restaurant Group? I've never heard of them." "They're new," one of the First Manhattan representatives explained. "A subsidiary of Meridian Global. They're acquiring mid-tier establishments across Manhattan, rebranding them into a chain concept." "Chain concept," Evan repeated, the words tasting bitter. "And they're offering $17 million, Wilkes stated flatly. "Cash deal. Immediate closing." Evan maintained his composure, though inwardly he reeled. The amount was nearly triple what he had calculated as the restaurant's market value. "That's substantial." "It's predatory," Diane corrected. "They're not buying a restaurant, they're buying prime Manhattan real estate. The building would be gutted, the concept completely abandoned." "Which is their prerogative," Wilkes countered. "The board has fiduciary responsibilities to the shareholders." "I'm the majority shareholder," Evan reminded them. Through his various shell companies and strategic stock purchases, he now controlled 51% of Moretti Holdings, a fact that had been finalized just 2 days earlier, though he hadn't yet revealed himself to the management. "Yes, on paper," Wilkes acknowledged with a condescending smile. "But there's a provision in the original transition agreement, one your legal team apparently missed." Diane's expression tightened. "We didn't miss it. We disputed its enforceability." "What provision?" Evan asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Wilkes produced another document, this one yellowed with age. "When Crowley's Fine Dining was sold and rebranded as Moretti's, A clause was inserted giving First Manhattan veto power over any future ownership changes that might affect the property's use as a restaurant. That doesn't make sense, Evan protested. Why would a financial institution care about the restaurant's continuity? The First Manhattan representatives exchanged glances. It was a condition of the financing, one offered vaguely. Regardless, Wilkes continued, they've exercised that option. Unless you match or exceed Lux's offer within 48 hours, the sale will proceed. Evan's mind raced. Even liquidating every asset he possessed, he couldn't come close to $17 million. That's not enough time. It's the time frame specified in the provision. Wilkes shrugged. Business is business, Mr. Crowley. As the meeting concluded, Diane walked Evan to the elevator, her expression grave. I'm sorry, Evan. We'll explore every legal avenue, but it doesn't look promising. There has to be something, Evan insisted. My father built that restaurant from nothing. It was his life's work. I know, Diane said gently, and I remember how devastated your mother was when she had to sell. But sometimes we have to let go of the past to move forward. Evan shook his head, determination hardening within him. Not this time. Not again. The afternoon air felt oppressive as Evan emerged onto the busy sidewalk. His phone showed 3 missed calls from the restaurant. His shift had started 30 minutes ago. Under normal circumstances, he'd be fired for the no-show. But normal circumstances had ceased to exist the moment he'd become Moretti's secret majority owner. Instead of heading toward the restaurant, Evan directed his steps toward Central Park. He needed space to think, to strategize. The shock of the morning's revelations had left him reeling, and the ticking clock, just 47 hours remaining now, pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. As he entered the park, the urban cacophony dimmed, replaced by the rustle of autumn leaves and distant laughter from a children's playground. Evan found an empty bench and sat heavily, loosening his tie as he tried to make sense of it all. $17 million. An impossible sum. But even more disturbing was the timing. How had this mysterious Lux restaurant group suddenly appeared with their offer, just days after he'd secured majority ownership? It couldn't be coincidence. His phone rang again. Vincent's number. Evan silenced it, but a moment later a text message appeared. Where are you? Emergency staff meeting. Your job is on the line. Evan almost laughed at the irony. Vincent had no idea he was threatening to fire his own boss. But the amusement faded quickly as he contemplated the restaurant's staff. Marco, Gabriella, Paolo, even Amanda, who'd been rehired after Evan had quietly spoken to Vincent. They would all lose their livelihoods if Lux took over. His phone buzzed once more. Not Vincent this time, but a number he didn't recognize. Evan answered cautiously. Is this Evan Crowley? A woman's voice, crisp and professional. Speaking. This is Dr. Levinson from Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm calling regarding Eleanor Winters. Evan frowned. I think you have the wrong number. I don't know an Eleanor Winters. That's strange. You're listed as the financial guarantor for her experimental treatment program. The approval came through this morning. Realization dawned slowly. Eleanor, Mara's mother. But why would his name be associated with her treatment? I'm sorry. Can you clarify when this arrangement was made? He asked. The paperwork was submitted last week, Dr. Levinson replied. A payment of $175,000 was processed yesterday from an account under your name. We just needed verbal confirmation before proceeding with treatment. Evan's mind raced. He had made no such payment, authorized no such arrangement. But someone had, using his name, his identity. Yes, he heard himself say. Please proceed with the treatment. After ending the call, Evan sat motionless, pieces falling into place. Vincent had been embezzling from the restaurant to help pay for Mara's mother's treatments. That much Mara had confirmed. But this new development suggested a far more complex scheme. His phone rang again. Mara's number this time. Evan had programmed it into his contacts after their sidewalk confrontation. I know it was you, she said without preamble when he answered. What was me? Don't play dumb. Her voice trembled slightly. The hospital just called. Mom's treatment has been approved and paid for, in full. A pause. They said it came from E. Crowley Investments. Evan chose his words carefully. I didn't authorize any payment, Mara. Then who did? Her voice cracked. Vincent swears it wasn't him. He's been fired, by the way. Some corporate lawyer showed up this morning and terminated him on the spot. The whole restaurant's in chaos. Fired? That made no sense. As majority shareholder, Evan hadn't authorized any personnel changes. Unless, Mara, I need to see you. Now. The urgency in his voice must have registered because she didn't argue. I'm at the hospital. Mount Sinai East Wing, room 412. 40 minutes later, Evan stepped into the sterile hospital room where an elegant woman lay sleeping. Her features gaunt, but still bearing traces of the beauty Mara had inherited. Mara herself sat beside the bed, her normally perfect appearance disheveled, dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked up as Evan entered, confusion and wariness mingling in her expression. "Why are you here? Why are you dressed like that?" Instead of answering, Evan placed his father's letter, the one he'd found in the cellar, on the table between them. "I think you should read this." Mara hesitated, then picked up the yellowed pages. As she read, her face paled. "This can't be right," she whispered. "My father would never." "I think he was trying to protect my family," Evan said quietly. "But someone got to him first. The same someone who's now trying to force me to sell the restaurant." Mara's eyes, filling with tears, met his. "Vincent. Not just Vincent." Evan shook his head. "He's a pawn. This goes much deeper." He moved to the window, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. "Your father and mine were friends, Mara. Real friends. And I think they were both betrayed by someone they trusted." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice small. Evan turned back to her. "I'm going to find out the truth, but I need your help." "Why would I help you?" Mara demanded, though her voice lacked conviction. "You've been lying since the moment you walked into Moretti's, playing waiter while secretly buying up shares." "Yes," Evan acknowledged. "I wanted to reclaim what was stolen from my family. But now I realize it's not just about ownership. It's about legacy, about what my father built and stood for." He paused. "Your mother's treatment has been paid for. That wasn't me, but I'm not going to reverse it either." Mara studied him, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. "Why?" "Because it's what my father would have done," Evan said simply. "And because I think your father tried to help mine, even though it cost him everything." The machines monitoring Eleanor Winters beeped softly in the background as Mara made her decision. She stood, smoothing her rumpled clothes with a gesture that seemed more habit than vanity. "What do you need me to do?" "I need to know everything about Vincent's connection to First Manhattan Capital," Evan said. "And I need access to your father's records from the time of my father's death." Mara nodded slowly. "I can get you the records. But Vincent," her expression hardened, "Vincent has been using me, using my mother's illness to cover his tracks. Whatever he's involved in, I want him to pay." As they spoke, Eleanor stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mara?" Her voice was thin, fragile as tissue paper. "Who's this?" Mara took her mother's hand. "Mom, this is Evan Crowley, Robert's son." Recognition flickered in the older woman's gaze. "Robert's boy," she murmured. "You have his eyes." "You knew my father?" Evan asked gently. "Oh yes." Eleanor smiled weakly. "He and Gregory were like brothers, always looking out for each other." Her gaze drifted to the window. "It broke Gregory's heart when Robert died. He tried so hard to save the restaurant for you." "Mom?" Mara leaned closer. "What do you mean he tried to save it?" Eleanor's focus seemed to waver, memories swimming just beneath the surface of consciousness. "The trust fund. He tried to protect it. But that awful man, Vincent's uncle, he found a way around the legal protections." Evan and Mara exchanged startled glances. "Vincent's uncle," Evan prompted. "Moretti," Eleanor whispered. "Michael Moretti. He promised Gregory he'd keep the restaurant running, keep the staff employed. But it was all lies." Her eyes drifted closed again. All lies. As Eleanor slipped back into sleep, Evan's mind raced with this new information. Michael Moretti, the name that had replaced Crowley's on the restaurant facade, wasn't just a random successor. He was Vincent's uncle, which meant Vincent's involvement ran deeper than simple embezzlement. "I had no idea," Mara said, her voice hollow. "Vincent never mentioned his uncle owned the restaurant before him. Because he didn't want you making the connection," Evan realized. It wasn't just a business acquisition, it was personal. The pieces were aligning, revealing a picture far more sinister than Evan had imagined. This wasn't just about reclaiming his father's restaurant anymore. It was about uncovering a 17-year-old betrayal that had destroyed 2 families. And now, with less than 2 days remaining before the forced sale to Lux Restaurant Group, Evan had to find a way not just to save his father's legacy, but to expose the truth, whatever the cost. Dawn broke over Manhattan like a whispered promise, pale light filtering through the windows of Moretti's restaurant. For the first time in 17 years, the morning preparation routines had been disrupted. No deliveries arrived at 5:45 a.m. No early prep cooks shuffled in at 6 km. The kitchen, usually alive with the clatter of pans and the hiss of warming ovens, lay dormant. Instead, a solitary figure moved through the silent dining room. Evan Crowley, dressed once again in his waiter's uniform rather than yesterday's business suit, carefully placed a single envelope on table 9, his father's table. His fingers lingered on the cream-colored paper embossed with the original Crowley's fine dining crest, a relic he'd preserved all these years. For a moment he'd imagined very differently than this one. 26 hours remained before the forced sale to Lux Restaurant Group. 26 hours to save not just a building or a business, but a legacy. A legacy that, Evan now understood, extended far beyond his own family. The restaurant door opened, the little bell above it tinkling softly. Gabriella entered, followed by Paolo, Marco, and several other staff members. Their faces registered confusion at finding Evan already inside. "What's going on?" Gabriella asked, her dark eyes suspicious. "First, Vincent gets fired by some suit we've never seen. Then we get texts to come in early for a mandatory meeting, but the place isn't even open." Evan gestured to the dining tables, which he had pushed together to create one long surface, reminiscent of the family-style staff meals his father had insisted upon every Sunday night during the Crowleys' era. "Please sit," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's coffee and pastries from Bellini's." He nodded toward the spread he'd arranged at one end of the makeshift conference table. The staff exchanged bewildered glances, but did as he asked. Some reached tentatively for coffee cups, while others simply waited, arms folded defensively across their chests. "Who are you, really?" Paolo finally asked, putting words to the collective suspicion. "Because you're clearly not just some waiter who can't carry a tray." Evan took a deep breath. "My name is Evan Crowley. My father was Robert Crowley, the original owner of this restaurant before it became Moretti's. And as of 3 days ago, I own 51% of this establishment." A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by Marco's soft exclamation. "I knew it. You have his eyes." "But why the deception?" Gabriella demanded. "Why pretend to be a waiter?" "Because I needed to understand what had happened to this place," Evan explained. "To see for myself what remained of my father's vision and who had remained loyal to it despite everything." He detailed the history they didn't know, how his father had died suddenly, how the restaurant had been taken over under suspicious circumstances, and how the Moretti family had systematically dismantled the trust fund meant to protect both the business and Evan's future. "And now they're trying to sell it out from under all of us," he concluded, "to a corporate chain that will gut the building and fire everyone." The news hit like a physical blow. Several staff members had been with the restaurant since the Crowley days. Others had families to support and bills to pay. The prospect of sudden unemployment in New York's competitive restaurant scene was daunting at best, catastrophic at worst. "How long do we have?" asked Amanda, the server Evan had saved from termination days earlier. "The sale is set to close tomorrow at noon," Evan replied grimly, "unless I can raise $17 million by then." A chorus of disbelieving laughter met this statement. $17 million? That's impossible." Paolo shook his head. "Not entirely," came a new voice from the doorway. Mara stood there, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, her appearance restored to its usual polished perfection, though those who looked closely might notice the slight redness around her eyes, evidence of a sleepless night. The staff regarded her with varying degrees of hostility. To them, she represented everything wrong with Moretti's current iteration, the entitled regular who demanded special treatment and cost a colleague her job over a simple accident. "What's she doing here?" Gabriella asked Evan, not bothering to hide her disdain. "Trying to help," Mara replied before Evan could answer. She approached the table and set down her portfolio. "My father was Gregory Winters. He was Robert Crowley's closest friend and business advisor. And last night I discovered he left me something that might just save this restaurant." She opened the portfolio and removed a stack of legal documents. "My father had a contingency plan. He suspected the Morettis had orchestrated Robert's death." "What?" Evan interrupted, shock coursing through him. "Orchestrated? Are you saying—" "I'm saying my father believed your father was murdered." Mara stated bluntly, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Not directly, nothing so obvious as poison or violence. But he believed the Morettis deliberately created situations to increase your father's stress levels, knowing about his heart condition. A stunned silence fell over the room. Evan felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. He'd always accepted his father's death as a tragic but natural event, a sudden heart attack brought on by the pressures of running a high-end restaurant in Manhattan. The possibility that it had been deliberately induced had never occurred to him. The evidence is circumstantial, Mara continued, but compelling. In the months before his death, Robert Crowley had been approached repeatedly by Michael Moretti with buyout offers. Each rejection was followed by mysterious problems: health code violations, supplier issues, reservation system glitches. I remember those. Marco nodded slowly. Robert was convinced someone was sabotaging us, but we could never prove anything. My father was investigating, Mara explained. He found connections between Michael Moretti and certain health department officials who had been conducting unusually frequent inspections of Crowley's. But before he could compile enough evidence, Robert died, and the restaurant was forced into a distress sale. Evan leaned heavily against a chair, his world tilting on its axis. And your father? Why didn't he come forward with this? Mara's expression tightened. Because the Morettis threatened my mother. They knew about her lupus diagnosis, knew how expensive her care would be. They offered my father a devil's bargain, his silence in exchange for guaranteed coverage of her medical expenses. But that didn't happen, Evan guessed, seeing the pieces align. No, Mara confirmed bitterly. Once they had what they wanted, my father's silence and cooperation in the restaurant transition, they reneged. When my father tried to fight back, they systematically destroyed his investment firm. Every client, every account, suddenly plagued with irregularities and audits. The implications hung heavy in the air. The Moretti family had not only stolen the Crowley legacy, but had crushed anyone who tried to protect it. So what's in those documents? Gabriella finally asked, nodding toward the portfolio. Mara allowed herself a small, grim smile. Insurance. My father may have been ruined, but he wasn't stupid. He created a trust with his remaining assets, designed to activate under specific conditions. She looked directly at Evan. One of those conditions was if a Crowley ever regained majority ownership of the restaurant. Hope flickered in Evan's chest. How much? 4 million, Mara said. Not enough to match Lux's offer, but enough to fight back legally. The trust also contains all the evidence my father gathered about the Moretti's manipulation and possible criminal activities. It wasn't 17 million, but it was a start. More importantly, it was validation. Proof that Evan's quest to reclaim his father's legacy wasn't just about personal vindication, but about righting a deliberate wrong. There's more, Mara continued, pulling another document from her portfolio. I found this in my mother's personal files last night. It's a letter from your father to you dated the day before he died. My father was supposed to deliver it if anything happened, but the Morettis intercepted it. With trembling hands, Evan accepted the sealed envelope, yellowed with age but still intact. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably his father's, the same distinctive script he remembered from birthday cards and notes tucked into his school lunches. As the staff watched in respectful silence, Evan opened the letter and began to read. His father's voice seemed to fill the quiet restaurant, speaking across the 17-year void between them. My dear Evan, if you're reading this, then my fears have been realized. I've felt the shadow of the Morettis growing longer over everything I've built, and Gregory agrees the threat is real. I've taken steps to protect you and the restaurant, but there are forces at work that even I didn't anticipate. Remember what I've always told you. A restaurant isn't just a business. It's a home for hungry souls. The value isn't in the real estate or the balance sheets. It's in the hearts we feed and the community we create. If you someday find yourself fighting for Crowley's, remember this above all. If you have to choose between the pride of ownership and the legacy of service, choose what feeds more hearts. I love you, son. Whatever happens, know that the greatest achievement of my life was not this restaurant, but watching you grow into a person who understands why it matters. All my love, Dad. Evan lowered the letter. His vision blurred with tears he made no attempt to hide. The words echoed in his mind, unlocking something he'd forgotten in his single-minded pursuit to reclaim what had been taken. What are you thinking? Mara asked softly. Evan looked around at the faces watching him, People who had devoted their lives to the art of hospitality, to his father's vision of a restaurant as a home for hungry souls. "I'm thinking my father was right," he said, "and I'm thinking I've been fighting the wrong battle." He stood straighter, determination replacing grief. "We have 26 hours. Let's make them count." 6 months had passed since that fateful morning meeting at Moretti's. 6 months of transformation, revelation, and healing. Manhattan's brutal winter had finally relented, giving way to a spring that seemed to mirror the renewal taking place within the walls of what was now, once again, Crowley's Fine Dining. Mara Winters stood before the newly installed memorial wall near the entrance, adjusting a frame that had tilted slightly during the lunch rush. The photograph inside showed the restaurant's original opening day 17 years earlier. Robert Crowley and Gregory Winters standing proudly before the red ribbon, their friendship evident in the easy way they leaned into one another. Beside it hung a more recent image. The entire staff gathered together on reopening night 3 months ago, their faces glowing with pride and possibility. "Perfect," a voice said from behind her. "Dad would have loved it." Mara turned to find Evan watching her, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked different now, more settled in his skin, the weight of his secret mission lifted from his shoulders. The waiter's uniform had been replaced with a tailored chef's jacket, embroidered with a small crown emblem, a subtle nod to his father's legacy. "Your father and mine both," Mara agreed, her own smile tinged with the complicated grief that still occasionally surfaced. Gregory Winters had died 2 years earlier, never seeing his daughter discover the truth he'd tried to protect, never witnessing the vindication of his suspicions about the Moretti family. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. The 26 hours following Evan's revelation to the staff had been a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, emotional confrontations, and moral reckonings. Armed with Gregory Winters' evidence and the support of the restaurant staff, Evan had made a bold decision. Rather than trying to match Lux Restaurant Group's $17 million offer, he'd gone public with the story of how the Moretti family had systematically destroyed 2 families to seize control of Crowley's Fine Dining. The New York Times had broken the story first. Manhattan restaurant empire built on sabotage and fraud, followed quickly by coverage across local and national media. The public outcry had been immediate and fierce. Longtime patrons of both Crowley's and Moretti's had come forward with their own observations of the suspicious transition. Food critics had penned scathing reassessments of Michael Moretti's supposed restaurant genius, and, most damaging of all, 3 former health department officials had admitted to accepting bribes to harass Crowley's with fabricated violations. Within days, Lux Restaurant Group had withdrawn their offer, citing reputational concerns. The criminal investigation into the Moretti family's business practices had sent the restaurant's stock plummeting, rendering the $17 million valuation moot. In the end, Evan had used the $4 million from Gregory Winters' trust not to buy back his father's restaurant, but to establish a cooperative ownership model that included every long-term staff member as a shareholder. He had retained a controlling interest, but the structure ensured that Crowley's Fine Dining would never again be vulnerable to a hostile takeover. "The lunch rush was impressive today," Mara noted, falling into step beside Evan as they moved toward the kitchen. "Paolo said we seated over 100 covers in 2 hours. Quality over quantity," Evan reminded her gently. "Dad always said a half-full restaurant with happy customers was better than a packed house with disappointed ones." Mara laughed. "Says the man who's been booked solid for 3 months straight with a waiting list into next year." It was true. The resurrection of Crowley's had captured the public's imagination in a way neither of them had anticipated. The combination of the dramatic backstory, Evan's dedication to his father's original vision, and the exceptional food emerging from the kitchen had made it the hottest reservation in the city. "Ms. Winters?" Amanda approached, her confidence having blossomed in her new role as floor manager. "Your mother just arrived. I've seated her at table 9. "Thank you." Mara smiled warmly. The relationship between them had evolved from antagonism to genuine respect over the past months, healing wounds neither had fully acknowledged. Evan glanced toward table 9, where Eleanor Winters sat, her appearance remarkably improved from the frail woman he'd met in the hospital room 6 months earlier. The experimental treatment, paid for through the liquidation of Vincent Moretti's seized assets, had produced what her doctors cautiously termed a significant remission. "Will you join us?" Mara asked Evan. "Mom was hoping to discuss the summer fundraiser with you." The Eleanor Winters Foundation for Lupus Research had become a joint project between the two families, a way to honor both the friendship of their fathers and to create something meaningful from the pain of the past. Of course, Evan agreed. Let me just check on the kitchen first. As Mara headed toward her mother's table, Evan pushed through the swinging doors into the domain he'd come to love more than any other part of the restaurant. The kitchen hummed with focused energy, so different from the chaotic tension that had characterized the Moretti era. Gabriella, now executive chef, orchestrated the dance of line cooks and prep staff with the precision of a symphony conductor. "Chef Crowley," she acknowledged him with a nod. "Just in time to taste the special." Evan accepted the small plate she offered, a modern interpretation of one of his father's signature dishes. The familiar flavors, updated but respectful of their origins, brought a lump to his throat. "Perfect," he declared after tasting. Dad would approve. Gabriella's normally serious expression softened. High praise. She hesitated, then added, "A man came in earlier, asking about employment. Said he used to work for your father years ago. Vincent's cousin." Evan stilled. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd consider any qualified applicant." Gabriella replied carefully. "Was that wrong?" Evan considered the question, his father's words from the letter echoing in his mind. If you have to choose between the pride of ownership and the legacy of service, choose what feeds more hearts. No, he decided. It wasn't wrong. Everyone deserves a second chance. Gabriella raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. She'd witnessed firsthand the transformation in Mara, from entitled, dismissive patron to dedicated partner in the restaurant's rebirth. If that level of redemption was possible, perhaps others deserved the opportunity as well. As Evan left the kitchen, he paused by the small office that had once been Vincent's domain. Now it housed a simple desk, a computer, and a wall of photographs chronicling the restaurant's history. The most prominent was a candid shot of his father in this very kitchen, flour dusting his cheeks as he laughed at some forgotten joke. Evan touched the frame lightly. "We did it, Dad," he whispered. When he emerged into the dining room, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the crystal glassware and creating prisms across the white tablecloths. At table 9, Mara and her mother were engaged in animated conversation, Eleanor's hands moving expressively as she described something that made Mara throw her head back in genuine laughter. The sight caught Evan like a physical sensation in his chest. Not the sharp pain of grief he'd carried for so long, but something warmer, more healing. This was what his father had meant. Not the building, not the business, but the moments of connection. The hungry souls being fed in ways that transcended mere food. As he approached the table, Mara looked up, her expression softening in a way that still surprised him after all these months. Their journey from antagonists to allies to something more complex had been as unexpected as it was profound. "There he is," Eleanor smiled warmly. "The man who saved 2 families with 1 restaurant." "I think it was the other way around," Evan replied, taking the seat beside Mara. "The family saved the restaurant." "Perhaps it's both," Eleanor suggested, her eyes, so like her daughter's, twinkling with the wisdom of someone who had stood at death's door and returned with newfound clarity. "That's the beauty of legacy, isn't it? It works in both directions." As they discussed plans for the summer fundraiser, Evan noticed an elderly gentleman being seated across the dining room. It took him a moment to recognize Mr. Harrington, the patron whose check had connected him to his father's old friend, the man who had seen through his waiter disguise with the simple observation, "You have his eyes." Mr. Harrington caught Evan's gaze and raised his water glass in a subtle toast. Evan returned the gesture, feeling the full circle of his journey in that simple exchange. "What are you thinking about?" Mara asked softly, noticing his momentary distraction. Evan turned back to her, taking in the face that had transformed in his perception from symbol of entitlement to emblem of resilience. "I'm thinking about that first day, when you laughed at me for dropping the tray." Mara winced. "Not my finest moment." "Maybe not," Evan agreed with a gentle smile, "but necessary in its way. It was the first step on this path." Eleanor observed them with knowing eyes. "Your fathers would be proud," she said simply. "Not just of what you've restored, but of what you've created that's entirely new." As the afternoon light lengthened into early evening, the restaurant began to fill once more. Servers moved with practiced grace between tables. Paolo greeted regulars with warm familiarity at the door. And from the kitchen came the comforting symphony of a well-orchestrated dinner service beginning. Evan looked around at the space that had haunted his dreams for 17 years, not with bitterness now, but with gratitude. The hungry souls his father had spoken of included his own, he realized, and in feeding others, in continuing the legacy of hospitality that transcended ownership or pride, he had finally found nourishment for himself as well. To new beginnings, Mara proposed, raising her glass. And honored endings, Evan added, completing the toast. As their glasses clinked, the sound seemed to ripple through the restaurant like a benediction, the perfect note to begin another evening of feeding both bodies and hearts in the place that had, at last, come home to itself. Evan and Mara's journey reminds us that true legacy isn't found in buildings or businesses, but in the lives we touch and the hearts we nourish. When faced with the choice between ownership and service, between pride and compassion, Evan chose what his father had always valued most, feeding hungry souls in ways that transcend mere food. What would you have done in Evan's position? Would you have pursued revenge against those who wronged your family, or found the courage to transform that pain into something healing? Sometimes the people who hurt us most become instrumental in our greatest redemption stories, just as Mara's initial cruelty became the catalyst for a partnership that saved both their families' legacies. This story asks us all, what matters more, getting even or getting whole? If you found value in this reflection on forgiveness, justice, and the true meaning of legacy, please support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more stories that touch the heart and challenge the soul. Your comments make these stories come alive, so tell us below what touched you most about Evan and Mara's journey from enemies to allies.